morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and even in the soon-to-be-banned TikTok. Yes, we are rebels on that platform. Who knows? Maybe we'll even go to the Communist Party-owned Red Note. I can't promise what we're going to do. It's going to be an interesting few weeks there for sure. And Fridays are a celebratory day, not only because the weekend's about to come upon us, but it's the day that we get to talk to Mike Sando of The Athletic, and really, really excited to bring him aboard. And soon, hopefully, Dave Boling will figure out how to click on the join link, and we'll get him in here as well.
What a shot. A great shot at Dave. But you're probably correct, because I know one thing about Dave Boling. He's not going to be late to something. Okay. When I used to travel with him on the road, when I was a young lad, he'd be down in the lobby. We have to meet somewhere at like 6 a.m. or something. He'd be in that lobby at about 5 a.m. Yeah, I couldn't sleep. Yeah, I've been down here. And I would be just, sleeping to the exact last minute, maybe oversleeping back then. And then he trained me up and I got old, and now I get up early too.
Well, he says he's backstage, which there's not a backstage, so I'm not sure where he is. So I'm going to send him the join link to try. But you know what? This is going to be a news story we get to tell about Dave. Oh, look at, there he is. There he is. And you know what? We're not going to embarrass him by saying who was in the screen to help him get on correctly. I'm sure he'll out himself.
You know who that was. Okay, am I on?
Am I on? Hello?
You exist, Dave. You exist. We validate your existence.
I'm sorry.
It would be better if for the first 10 seconds you were muted accidentally, though. Could you do that? Just kidding. So you got to unmute yourself. That's funny.
Hi, guys.
Hello, Dave. It's so good to see you Friday. How are you doing?
I'm fighting a little walking pneumonia, apparently. So if you hear me hacking, that's I'll put myself on mute while I cough up lungs or anything. But I'm good.
Yeah, I want to know too, the wrist hand. I'm not seeing you got the splint on there. Okay, Dave's a bouncer. Yeah. Dave's a bouncer in his off hours. He had to clock this guy at the door the other night.
He was saying bad thing about Hawk Blogger, and I had to stand up for your honor.
If you're going to clock everybody who says a bad thing about Hawk Blogger, you're going to have a lot of wrist splints. Let me tell you, there's no shortage of them. It's funny. It's not funny, but like you talk about the walking pneumonia, I've been battling the same thing. So
it's going around, and it's not enough to keep me from working or doing what I want. Right. But I can't sleep, and all that stuff. And so finally it was, you got to go in and see people. And so
I know that moment.
Good.
Well, appreciate you fighting through. Everyone is excited to have you aboard, and I think tops are that we haven't had a chance to talk to you, Dave, about the Seahawks season that was. And the last time you and I were on with Mike, you had written an article talking about the baby boomers. This was after the Arizona game, and they had really looked like they had found their form. And then, oh my gosh, those two home games against Green Bay and against Minnesota, it just fell apart. So talk to us about the season from your perspective.
We deal with the week to week. And the anguishes that everybody has over all the small things. And I think it's good at this point to go back and maybe get some distance. At the start of the season, if we'd have heard 10-7, everybody out there would have taken that. Especially how it ended, I think, where you see the defense turned into, you've got the stats, but I think they were probably like a top 10 defense in the last 2 months of the year. Okay, with guys who are really on the rise and solving some problems, and guys like Love and Bryant finding places to join Leonard Williams and Witherspoon, who I think would have been second half All-Pros, fully deserving of being All-Pro, at least in the second half. So it seemed to me like, again, that's another thing. some of the young guys stepping in, they're filling in spots. Maybe some people getting better than you expected. I don't think we would have expected Ernest Jones to be the guy in there. And so I think there were two big points in the season that we've talked about. Certainly the first one where they fired the linebackers. This won't work. We can't have this. You change some starters around. This isn't working. And then the other point that I think was the day after the season where they fire the offensive coordinator. And it's not against Ryan Grubb, and I don't have the expertise or have studied it in minute detail that I know a lot of your constituents probably have. I didn't see him as a major obvious problem, except for the reason he got fired.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't find ways to run the ball. Well, and then obviously Geno Smith started straining and getting out of his lanes. And again, you didn't find ways to protect him. Either you didn't get the players to block for him, which obviously is one enormous thing, but you weren't able to scheme some things around that. And I think those two things, Mike Macdonald came out and let it be known, this is not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
We're 10-7. That doesn't work for him. And I think that was an enormous statement right off the bat. This isn't what we want to do. This isn't the toughness we want to play with specifically. And if you're not going to meet the standards, you're going to be gone. And I think if there is one overriding theme of this year is establishing his level of expectations. And I think in that regard, it was all a positive season.
I think that's really well said, Mike. I'm curious your thoughts here. I mean, like, and I think Dave's right that one thing that really is clear from this year is Mike Macdonald is not going to be patient. He will absolutely let folks have opportunity, but when he's not going to do the Pete Carroll thing necessarily, where guys hang on for years and years, players or coaches. Honestly, Pete Carroll, his first year, like when he first got here, players and coaches had the same short leash to some extent that we're seeing from Mike Macdonald in his first year, but Pete did it with a lot more experience than Mike Macdonald did.
Remember, Pete, they were setting the record for transactions.
Exactly.
Oh, it's been 200 since this date or whatever. I haven't
350 or something by the end of the year.
Yeah. They haven't been doing that. And I think back then they were making all kinds of trades too, little ones trying to get this guy or that guy.
Chris
that
Clemens.
This doesn't feel like that because I think the GM's been here a long time, and remember they hired Mike Macdonald to get more out of what was already here, as opposed to just blowing up the whole thing. And you're right; they have been willing to what looks like make people ultimately accountable. Right now, over a long period, I think that makes a lot of sense early on if you don't have the right people. After a while, it's your job to make sure you have the right people so you don't get do-overs over and over, right? You don't get to do another offensive coordinator this year and then that doesn't work out. Then that's a reflection on you. But I think it's okay. In the first year, I think it was good. I think that most of the moves that they made, we feel like, that's probably more of a good sign than a bad sign that they made those moves, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. And this is one of the things I'm curious about your perspectives on, because you guys know how it works when a GM essentially makes the case to some extent to ownership that we've got the right players, but we're not getting the most out of them. That puts a lot of pressure on the coach that comes in and the GM. But here's something like the expectation, like the logical extension of that is, okay, if that's the case, then Mike Macdonald should be able to take this same group of players and win 13 games and go to the playoffs. And like, that's where a lot of people go. That's not where my mind goes. And there's something that John Schneider said in a pre-game interview. It's very small. Most people didn't probably hear it. He talked about it's going to be a process to get to the kind of tough team we want to have. When you say process, I'm wondering if he made the case to ownership, and a hard case to make. Like, it's going to take a couple years for Mike and I to fix this. That's
I don't
how
think
did,
I doubt that case was made, but the fact that
okay.
they went 10-7, their record did get better. I mean, I think look, Pete Carroll's a great coach. So it wasn't like they were taken over an absolute lost cause. 2
Hmm.
weeks before the end of the season, everybody wasn't saying for sure he's going to be fired. It wasn't seen as there were frustrations that were lingering in the fan base, but it was still probably nationally a little bit of a surprise that Pete was let go, wouldn't you say, from people that weren't super
Oh, I
close to
think
it?
there's a surprise around here as well, for sure.
Yeah, so they're not taking over a completely broken thing. I think that as I outlined expectations for the season, I thought it was important for the record to not get worse. I thought it would be good if it got better, and the defense had to be fixed. And there, you have to have some kind of a feeling that this defensive coach you brought in knows what he's doing, and we're going to see this defensive malaise. It's been a 10 years of getting 5% worse every year. We would see maybe get to the middle of the pack. And I think they got more than middle of the pack to
Hmm.
where we saw some bona fide stars on the defense, the talented players that they had acquired, Leonard Williams, right, or Witherspoon in the secondary. These were guys that the front office had great hope for, and they gave up a lot for for both of them. And they both played well enough that you could have made a case for them to be all pro, right? So I see those things as successful. I see the offensive thing as disappointing because that's your job as the head coach too, to come in
Hmm.
and what do you mean what do you mean we're not playing the style you want to play? Isn't your job to get somebody here who's going to run the style of offense you want to run? That's a legitimate criticism to me, but not a fatal one
Hmm.
because of the circumstances of him coming in, youngest coach, hired late, uh, you know, front office helping with the hire probably of the some of the staff. So I think he gets another chance now, and I'm fine with it.
And I'm curious about considering the perspective of the general manager making a case to ownership, because the general manager has built this, what is here.
Exactly.
And that you
Yeah,
look through, and we saw that period of hollow drafts for several years, and some
yeah,
trades that didn't work out. Well intended, well studied, I'm sure. A lot of things didn't work out, and that left them hollowed, and to the point where I think Pete Carroll, as many of us have done, deserves great praise, keeping that team somewhat competitive and not hitting basement. And who is still here from that period is the general manager, and I'm been fairly supportive of the work they do and their drafts. It's pretty obvious they've missed, and some positions where that we were going to get into at some point, offensive line.
Hmm.
They don't make enough offensive linemen that you can afford to miss on,
Hmm.
and you have to draft some too that you develop, and that has been a chronic for a number of years problem. And when I look at Geno Smith and people say, oh, he's not the kind of guy that can take you very far. Well, the way you can improve quarterback play is protect him, teach some people, buy some people, get some people who can protect him. And I think if he is, in my mind, mid-range, maybe tending toward the upper middle class, which is some of the plays he makes are spectacular.
Hmm.
He's forced too often to make spectacular plays. How do you get Geno up that next tiny bit, another 2 or 3 rungs on that ladder? Protect him.
100%. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Just to complete the thought, the reason I brought up it'd be hard for John Schneider to make the case that this is going to take a couple of years, given kind of the case he probably made that they needed to move on from Pete. At the same time, you could look at Mike McDonald, and if you look at it from a lens of this is a first-time head coach who knows that he's got to nail this, or he might not have a job. Like a lot of coaches, you generally wouldn't have a lot of those guys have the courage to make this many changes, to be this decisive in their first job. It almost feels like he's got it in his head. Either he's just naturally got that and he doesn't care and he's just going to make the decisions he thinks is right. I think that's totally plausible. Or he also feels like and he talks about it when he talks. John and I have talked about it, what we're building here. They talk about building. I think a lot of fans perceive this as built. And so I do wonder if he thinks he's got a few years to kind of get this in the right way.
I think he does. Yeah. I don't buy the idea that, they're super close and we're making this change and it better go to the Super Bowl right away. I don't see it that way at all. It was time for a change, and they thought the team was underachieving some, and it was. They got better in some ways. Now the offense fell off, and that's the offensive line and all of that goes on the GM and the coordinator to some point, in just in terms of how they play. But I don't think Mike Macdonald was coming in thinking, I've got 1, maybe 2 years to really get over the top. I would doubt that he saw it that way.
Dare we say Jim Mora didn't see it that way either, but
yeah, but he was. Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's funny, but he was like, he was coach in waiting. It was a Gerard Mayo that didn't work well for him either, following a legend.
It's funny the way you guys are talking about it. It makes me think of this other piece. So Pete Carroll, I think we all have a lot of respect for Pete Carroll as a coach, and it would say, yeah, he was probably getting a lot out of this team, even if it wasn't the maximum out of this team. But we don't talk about coaches in the same way we talk about quarterbacks. If I told you right now that you could get a Geno Smith level quarterback that was 25 years old or 23 years old, pick the youngest one in the league.
Yeah.
And you could have him on a rookie deal. Would you take it? Not a Patrick Mahomes level, a Geno Smith level quarterback. Would you take it?
You mean draft it?
Yep.
How early?
Let's just the point is less about that and about if you could take the same production but have a younger person in the seat. If the only thing that was different was the age.
Of course, you would rather have Geno Smith be 23 than 34 and play the same way.
Right. I think if you look at that from a coaching perspective, you've got incrementally better in the record and significantly better defensively, and you went from the oldest coach in the league to the youngest coach in the league. I think that also has some value in this whole calculus. Because
Russell Wilson coming in, Wilson coming in allowed them to invest in other places.
Exactly.
Of course, if you're not spinning it, it's just one of the beautiful components of the calculus of roster building. If you can get a rookie quarterback, get a rookie contract quarterback who can function.
Yeah.
I think 100%. And I guess the point I'm making there is even if Pete gets a new job, there's a time, he's not going to be coaching for 5 years. I don't think. You have a limit on how much longer he's going to be coaching. He might have coached his last game in the NFL. We don't know. But with Mike Macdonald, you don't have that. You can, if he's able to demonstrate progress and he's able to maintain and build on where Pete Carroll was, you've got the youngest coach in the league, and you don't have this time ticking of okay, when are we going to have to change out our coach?
I see the analogy you were going for there.
Yes, yeah. It was a weak one and poorly executed.
No. But now
that
makes sense, and it's a more obvious point than you normally make.
You're saying he's hard to follow?
Excuse me, but that was.
I appreciate that. Yes, I'm.
But sure, everything. And that's true. If it's on the rise, and part of it, sure, as we've said before. Toward the end of when they fired Pete, that's too bad. But nobody was saying, wait a minute, he had us on the verge of going to the Super Bowl again. I don't think anybody was thinking that. This kid, I call him a kid, I can do that as someone who is Pete Carroll's age. This guy has that sense when you come in, and I think everybody in the locker room feels it. He has a degree of competence. And I think that's pretty obvious. You hear him, some of the defenders talk about this guy's a wizard, or he was the smartest guy on the Ravens staff. That goes a long way into how these guys approach their job. It will go a long way to corralling free agents. We got this guy. Look at this reputation. Look what we did. And I think that is a sense of upward trajectory that the franchise needed and needs to foster.
I'm just surprised that it's still being litigated, the coaching change. That surprises me.
It will endlessly be litigated.
It didn't feel like it was. I mean, I get it. I think I've defended Pete Carroll when people were criticizing him. I think he's excellent, but they did make a change, and it didn't all fall apart. And let's see where it goes, right?
Well, I think that's like, set aside whether it was the right or wrong decision. I think the next part is like, what's his ceiling? What can he build a championship team? That's the question that every coach comes in with. And I kind of wanted to like, what's a reasonable expectation? Because, I think a lot of folks think, okay, we're going to drop someone in here, and within a couple of years, we're going to be like, you look at Pete Carroll's trajectory and John Schneider when they first got here. Would you guys agree that was probably as rapid a turnaround of roster and place in the league as you could possibly do, from going from like one of the oldest and least talented rosters to a Super Bowl team within 3 years?
But 3 years, you look back. I'm sorry, Mike.
Yeah.
3 years, you have to remember 2.5 years into that, Pete Carroll was several games under 500. I think down in Dallas, he had to say, we're going to lose our jobs if we don't start running the ball. And he introduced a mandate. We're going to start running the ball. We're going to play. If we're going to lose our jobs, I'm going to lose it being me. And you can remember him saying that. It took a long time. It was not overnight by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, and they didn't have their quarterback until the third year. And even then, at 2-2 record in the third year, I went on the radio and they were asking me if they were going to stick with Russell Wilson or make the change. So they had gone through Hasselbeck and then Tavares Jackson, and then they drafted a guy in the third round. Does that sound like a lot of urgency to you?
And brought in Flynn.
Yeah, there was no guarantees at all that this was going to take off from that standpoint. And then Russell Wilson really was perfect for them. So we look back with absolute certainty that this was going to happen, right? There's uncertainty with all of it, including now. You don't know what's going to happen. They could plateau and never get over the hump. Well, and that could have happened to Seattle before.
That's why I use this, and I think it's going to endlessly be this benchmark that people come back to. And I would say they got a Hall of Fame potential player in each of their first 3 drafts together. Like, not saying that they're certain, but like whether you're talking about Earl Thomas, Cam Chancellor, Richard Sherman, Russell Wilson, Bobby Wagner, like the first 3 years. So you get this massive accumulation of top shelf talent. You make a lot of great trades for Marshawn Lynch, for Chris Clemens, like everything comes together. You have great coaches. Dan Quinn, is there, comes back. And then even with all of that going that well and being that young and that talented, it took Richard Sherman tipping a pass in his own end zone at home to be able to get to the Super Bowl and win one, right? So like it is so much has to go right. And if you look at this right now, I look at the Seahawks, I'm like, have they drafted any I think the last 3 drafts have been pretty good. Do we think any of those players are Hall of Fame potential players in their first few years where we can see that trajectory?
Yeah. I see maybe 2 glorious things happening.
Yes.
But and this is, as I've looked back, this is 10 years since they won their last championship game. When I just talked to John Ryan this week for a column, kind of funny, on his fake field goal touchdown that really got them to the second. It was, that changed the game, got them to their second Super Bowl. They had so many guys. They had so many great players. As you say, up and coming potential Hall of Famers, but certainly multiple Pro Bowl people at so many positions. You start looking at the drafts, 15, 16, et cetera. And I wonder, part of it is we don't have a place to put these people. What are we going to do with this? And you can't just get rid of people, that were that good. It was almost politically with the fan base difficult to get the kind of roster churn that keeps it young and healthy with the balance of expensive guys, mid-range guys playing positions, and young kids filling in. And that is the balance that really shifted, and in some ways maybe is a bit of an excuse for why they didn't rebuild that talent, because there was so much. They hit so many guys off the start.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, part of the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think it is an impossible benchmark to meet. You will probably never see that level of talent accumulation in that short a period of time with a coach who's bringing in a scheme that also was like, no one was drafting tall cornerbacks back then. Like, everything kind of coalesced and you barely got one, which was great. And so what's the more typical way? I think people think about baseball. Baseball, it's pretty tried and true. You just tank. You trade for prospects. We're not going to talk about the Mariners because it's going to hurt everyone's heart too much. But like, there's kind of this way to do it. NFL, like, I don't know if you guys agree with this, but tanking and getting a bunch of high picks is not necessarily the way to do it. And if I'll give you some examples, but there's a lot of these examples where it took years, 5, 6, 10 years for John Elway to win a Super Bowl, right? Like, we're looking at Josh Allen has never even got there, and he's probably the MVP this year. So I think the expectations of how to build a team are like really out of whack with the NFL.
Joe Montana was on the trading block his third year. We need to get rid of this guy.
It's so hard. I was looking through the Seahawks playoff log. If you go to Pro Football Reference, you can look at all the playoff games, and you realize that, because I was trying to think, okay, what is true progress? And I feel like getting to championship games is a big deal. Like, if that's a real benchmark of being a real team, don't you think? Getting to that round,
absolutely.
And so when you look at the history of the Seahawks, to even win 2 playoff games in the same postseason, that's only happened in, let's see, 14-13. So there's 2 years. 05, that's 3 years, and 83, 4 years. So 4 times in the 50-year history of this team, you even won 2 playoff games in the same season. Think about that. Think how hard that is.
I covered most of those stinkers.
That's right. Yeah.
That's why I'm probably a little less critical than a lot of the contemporary.
But that's why that perspective is so valuable.
Yeah, exactly.
You talk about Geno Smith. Geno Smith's numbers, they went a long time without having a quarterback of that caliber, and it's.
I was shocked to know Kelly Stoffer's been calling college football. Speaking of, you want to talk about quarterback challenges?
He parlayed his Seahawks career, into that.
He made a lot of money, I know, going the supplemental route or whatever. He sat out a year, and that was a great bunch with Dan McGuire, Kelly Stoffer. Oh boy,
yeah, Stan Gelbaugh, that whole crew for sure.
It was a tough.
But I'm curious, Mike. Do you have a perspective on this about like how NFL teams think about constructing championship teams? Is it do they have a philosophy that's kind of pervasive?
Well, it's hard to find a lot of those teams that aren't good on their lines, especially on the offensive line. To me, I think that's anytime you're building a team, you want to have that part be really good. And if you look at the teams that are left right now, you're probably not going to see a lot of bad ones, right? Starts up front. So, let's just look at the games. Houston's in here. Theirs is bad, and they're just barely been holding on. They're only in because they're atop a bad division, right? I mean, the Chiefs have fortified the middle, probably the best 3 interiors in the league. Detroit, best offensive line in the league. Buffalo's line is a top 5 line this year. Baltimore has had good offensive lines. The Eagles might be the second best offensive line, and the Rams got their offensive line healthy late in the year. And then the Commanders have just done a great job. Like, their line played good this year. Maybe they need to figure out what the Commanders did, because they went last year from being criticized for their offensive line to, I think, it being pretty good with a lot of the same guys. So some of that could just be not throwing the ball 157 times a game like they did last year under Eric Bieniemy. They totally changed with a different type of a scheme, and now that offensive line looks good. So maybe that's what if I'm the Seahawks, you're not going to get the Eagle line right. You're not going to get the Detroit line tomorrow. You're not going to get it. You've got to work towards that. And then maybe in a commander way, find a way to that, our line doesn't have to suck, frankly, right? These guys are better than that. They're not all a bunch of bad players, and it should look better.
The Ravens have some weak spots.
Yeah.
As great as they are, it's a tremendous offense they've got, and they have some wonderful options. Historically, if you look at it, they don't make enough good offensive linemen that you can miss. So you need to go and you invest the high one on a left tackle that you're going to have for 10 years, and you keep them. And that's when a lot of teams, you build them. You look at Dallas with Tyron Smith, and you look at all of us teams with great left tackles. That is the one cornerstone. I think they probably got, I think you can feel pretty good about Cross at left tackle right now, being a guy who is improving and is talented. I thought when they spent a first and a third to get Cross and Lucas, they were doing something right. And I remember doing the column applauding them. These two guys, and I really like Lucas when he's healthy. Yeah, how do you predict it? Those two investments I felt were the cornerstones of this offense. And then with Lucas's injuries and the fact that nobody else they picked in the middle has worked. You spent what was Haynes a third? He was the second pick, a third rounder. I see nothing. Bradford, big, strong guy. We see very little. You've got the 6th round rookie playing right guard. You've got the center who retires. I don't know what's going on there. Tomlinson at left guard. What's going on there? You've got one really good guy playing left tackle, and they've made investments that they've gone wrong. They haven't been good. They haven't developed them. And if you look at as Mike was saying, you look at these good offensive lines, they've got people who come in and they realize if they're good, you've got to pay them to keep them. And keeping an offensive line together, that cohesion and that consistency is how you build an offense. And that has not been a strength. It has been a real chronic weakness, certainly for a decade.
You know what Max Unger's last year was with the Seahawks? 2014.
Yes. Oh, I know.
Yeah.
Obviously, he was hurt some that year, but came back for the playoffs. But, I just.
And who's the last?
Yeah, go ahead.
That was last. I mean, the bankable. And I think Cross is kind of the first guy you've got since then, really. Dwayne Brown was at the end, but.
Well, yeah, I don't think you have to overthink this too much. I mean, I think they have had a revolving door of people up front, and that's not a way to be good.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, and we'll probably spend a little time talking about whether it'll really actually change this year or not, and John Schneider's approach to it. But I mean, part of what I look at, fellas, is there's not a lot of these. I don't think you're going to see a lot of these 3-year. And granted, it's not the same because I think the Seahawks actually have already started to accumulate talent, and I think that they're young. They already are a young team, so it's not the same as 2010. But you look at who's the best coach in the game right now. Maybe Andy Reid.
Probably John Harbaugh.
Probably recognized that way.
Yeah.
You know how many years Andy Reid was a head coach before he won a Super Bowl?
Right, but he went to one,
Really?
and it was in like 4 or 5 championship games very quickly.
He went to a Super Bowl in his 6th season. He didn't win a Super Bowl until his 21st season. And I don't say that because that means that the Super Bowl is the only arbiter of whether you're a good coach or not, but to just indicate like you can, like the amount of ways that you can lose are are infinite.
But Andy Reid comes in, goes 5-11, and then he's 11 double-digit wins almost every year for a bunch of years, and they went to 4
Mm-hmm.
straight conference championship games. In his third, fourth, fifth, and sixth seasons, they went to the championship game at least. So that's awesome, and that's an incredible standard. That's why I think those championship games are a real standard of what are you relevant. Are you in the mix? You're not going to win it all. I start from the fact that it would be, to me, it's almost lucky if you get to win it all, but you got to be in the mix. You got to be not just in the playoffs, but sometimes win a playoff game.
And so it's so much more than coaching, obviously.
Yeah.
Roster building, the ownership, your headquarters situation. There's so many things that play into it. Assistance. Another thing that Mike and I saw really up close was during the Holmgren years, where the coaching staff that he had in those 4, 5, 6 seasons that were, where they were really red hot and rolling, they were losing guys every couple of years. They were losing coordinators or whatever. And pretty soon you're just not able to replace those guys. And the same thing happened with Pete, with Gus Bradley, Dan Quinn, et cetera, et cetera. And pretty soon you're kind of the people who are still there who haven't moved on for 3 or 4 years, maybe aren't the best minds that you have on the staff. They get elevated because of their seniority. They know, where the printer ink is, and where do you put the playbooks, and so they get elevated. And really, the quality of a staff is, I think, one of the great underappreciated elements of team success, and it's cohesion too. You got to understand they have to have this shorthand, and they can just tell what it is they have to fix, and that's hard to build, and that takes time.
Well, and let's take another of the runs that the Seahawks made to the Super Bowl that was not 3 years. The first time they went in 2005, they drafted Walter Jones in the 90s. They drafted Steve Hutchinson early in the 2000s. They had Sean Alexander. They had Matt Hasselbeck. They had so many of the pieces that were the reason that they went to the Super Bowl well before they ever went. And that took probably 7-8 years to build.
They couldn't get over. That team just had a hard time with the defense because they, Fritz Shermer was the great coordinator who died right after coming with Mike Holmgren over, and it took Holmgren a number of years to just cycling through coordinators. And in 2005, they drafted Lofa Tupu, which was just such a big deal for kind of organizing their defense. And then they didn't get great on defense, but they got good enough that the defense wouldn't prevent them from winning. Right? It used to be so bad that they almost,
brought in Julian Peterson, right? And I mean,
remember that game. They played Kansas City in the early 2000s there, and I mean, it was like both teams scored on every drive. It felt like you're just completely out of control of the game, and they were able to get that fixed for a brief period of time. It was difficult, and if you were going to draw a parallel to this team, I think we would say the offensive line is the defense that's holding them back, probably, right? So you have to be able to fix that, and the good organizations do. And I look at the two best teams in the league this year by record or by anybody could include Detroit and Kansas City. And these are teams that have thrown resources at problem areas. Detroit had problems in their secondary. They drafted multiple guys. They made a trade with Tampa Bay, and they got to be pretty better in the secondary. They've had a lot of injuries, and then you look at Kansas City, got exposed in the Super Bowl, and they went and got a bunch of offensive linemen, and they fixed it. So you've got to be able to put out these fires. It feels like a little bit in Seattle, they haven't even always acknowledged that there is a fire.
Well, that is what gets people raging among Seahawks fans for sure. And I think part of where I'm kind of getting with all this conversation is I think that there's this belief that there's a very linear path to being a championship team. Get the young hot quarterback. Well, Peyton Manning, he didn't get there for 10 years. John Elway didn't get there he didn't win one for 20 years.
Dan Marino never did.
Dan Marino, like there's like that's not a try. You can't like yes, it helps. You can go on and on and on. What I think ends up being is like what's limiting you, and how much time do you have? Like for the Seahawks, I personally, and I know this is a controversial take, I don't think Geno Smith's level of play is what's limiting the Seahawks from being a contending team. I do think his age will become a limiting factor for how many more years you have that. So you have to kind of remove that limit so you have as much time to build what you need that can end up being competitive.
And, you want to obviously always be looking for that elite difference maker quarterback. But in the meantime, you have to build your team to win anyway. And all of the evidence that I've looked at shows that if you can get to a certain level on defense, if you get to a really good level, then you win most of the games anyway. Every quarterback wins 90% of the games when the other team doesn't score more than 17 points. Stuff like that. Okay.
The Trent Dilfer Ravens.
Absolutely. You can't tell. I've done the studies. Alex Smith's win-loss record is the same as Tom Brady's when the other team doesn't score much. Okay. So that is a big part of being able to compete and be in the window when you don't have Josh Allen, right? When you have Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson or one of these guys, then sometimes when your defense is bad, you might win anyway. But look at Joe Burrow. He's outstanding, and they're a little bit out of control. And they got to be too bad on defense to where even he, with those elite wide receivers, can't do it. So I always think you need to get the defense in order. It's what raises your floor right away. And then you keep building and everything else. And maybe you do hit a quarterback. Like, that's what Seattle did. They hit a quarterback who was good enough that they could win a championship with that all-time great defense. And as we saw later, when it was an all-time great defense, Russell was good. They could go to the playoffs, but he wasn't going to Mahomes them to win it all, right? Because there's only one, or even Reno couldn't do it, right? It's really hard to do. So you've got to build this. That's why I feel like it's such a big amount of progress that they made with this defense is hugely important. Hugely important. That will keep you in the that will keep you in the mix within striking distance. And then if you can get the quarterback and the offense really rolling, you'll really have something.
It allows you to save money at the high figure offensive positions.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and it's such a simple point, and I think that that's what makes it so powerful. Ultimately, if you score more points than your opponent, you win. Like that's the thing. And though, if you look back at history of the great NFL teams, you either will find an offense that is so prolific, the greatest show on turf, that the defense doesn't have to be that good. It just
they won one championship.
Right, they won one championship.
Was averaging 30 points a game. They couldn't win.
And Manning's Broncos were the most prolific offense in history, and the Hawks clobbered them in the Super Bowl.
So, but I would say, I always say this: if you go back to the greatest championship quarterbacks over history, Terry Bradshaw, best defensive 70s. Joe Montana, best defensive 80s. The 49ers lead the league in points allowed, fewest points allowed in the 80s. No one talks about it. Mm-hmm. You start getting into the 90s and looking at the Troy Aikman or the Brett Favre teams, or even when the 49ers won it, they got Deion Sanders. Those were all really good defensive teams. Then you get into the 2000s and it's like, wow, Brady's unbelievable. He is unbelievable. But their defense is in the top 5 and their special teams is in the top 5 for the whole time almost. Mm-hmm. And so otherwise he would be just like Rodgers and all these other guys who, what happened? Oh, well, the Seahawks got the onside kick, or there's so many times Rodgers loses when he's not even on the field. He's just standing there watching some calamity happen, right? And we see that this last week with Green Bay, same sort of thing. They're a young team that doesn't, have a bunch of the guys they can count on, that type of stuff. So I think all the way through, you see that defensive component with making the great quarterback be a championship winning quarterback. And that's why when you look at Drew Brees, 2008, 2009, they were a good defensive team. They won a Super Bowl. They had the bounty scandal within a few years. Their defense went to being really bad. And if you look, they had 3 years in a row, they went 7-9 with Drew Brees passing for 5,000 yards. Can't do it. Can't overcome it. There was no one better than Drew Brees probably then, but you can't do it. So that defense, people kind of laugh when you say defense win championship, because defense by itself doesn't win championships. You do have to have the quarterback usually. But name me the quarterbacks who are winning Super Bowls with bottom 5 defenses, and it's really been like Patrick Mahomes did it once or twice. If you can get that guy, be my guest. But you're not doing it if you're Rodgers. You're not doing it if you're Breeze. You're not doing it if you're Brady, even either. He didn't do it. He always had a good defense. Yeah. Yeah. So they're on the right track in that one area that lets everybody compete.
It's such a great point, and Detroit's a great example of that this year, where everyone's talking about the offense and how prolific the offense is. Up until all the injuries they had, they were a top 5 defense this year. That was the place that they probably made the biggest strides from last year to this year.
Oh, and their ranking on defense. In fact, they had the 8th biggest improvement statistically on defense from last year. Seahawks had the 3rd biggest. So, they've actually been a good defense. And now they may have to try to overcome, the fact that they have had a lot of injuries, and they may be good enough on offense to do it. But they're not as bad on defense as you think. They've actually done a nice job down the stretch, and that's why Aaron Glenn's in a lot of these conversations for head coach jobs.
Well, let's turn our attention there for a second. I don't know if you guys have opinions or thoughts about some of these OC names that have come out for the Seahawks. Obviously, Hank Fraley was for the Detroit Lions was one, but we just actually got a new name this morning. Byron Leftwich, former quarterback and former OC for a number of teams, has been confirmed as another candidate for the Seahawks. Curious if you guys have any reactions to that name for Seattle.
Not especially. I would be surprised if that's who they hired for the job, but I haven't talked to anybody about it. What's he been doing?
Well, I mean, the last time he was in the league was 2022. He was the Bucks OC. This was back with obviously Bruce Arians, who he has history with. Before that, he was at Arizona as an offensive coordinator / quarterbacks coach for 1 year. But I don't know what he's been doing since then.
I saw him as, seemed really promising coming up, because I think he just broke into the league like in the last 10 years with Arizona. And Arians was very good with his assistant coaches in kind of promoting them, right? And promoting them publicly. I think Bruce Arians has done a great job in doing that. But then we didn't see that really go anywhere with Leftwich in another team or another capacity. I think people felt like offensively when Bruce Arians was there, it was still kind of his show. So you would basically have 4 years really of a coordinator under the offensive play calling coach who's kind of a dominant personality. So if they were to see something in him, and then they would have to probably see that in their interviews, because I'm not sure that you would see it when you're underneath, the offensive head coach. Now that happens sometimes. Like Mike Sherman was the offensive coordinator for 1 year under Mike Holmgren in 1999, and got a head coaching job and ended up being a good play caller, I think, for a long time. But I don't know that you have that track record.
The other news I'll throw out, Dave, feel free
let me say,
go ahead.
I'm not studying these guys,
these
coordinators in granular level from a general sense. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is looking at Grubb, and I kind of want somebody, I would like them to consider people with some experience in the National Football League.
I think you're not alone in that.
I don't know that was a problem with Grubb. His offense at UW was spectacular. I've loved a lot of the pre-snap stuff that he put people in to diagnose and force them into leverage situations. Some of that didn't work, and I don't know, maybe with the shorter season in colleges or whatever, you can change things around. I don't know whether people can learn your system and force you to change and adapt during the season the way it happens in the NFL. And I think that's something that is an acquired talent. with experience. So if
Yeah.
I could hear them say they got somebody who I said an assistant OC or something in that position for some other team in the NFL, I would kind of feel better if they went in that direction.
Do you think that they're sitting there going, you know what? If we can get somebody with a no risk it, no biscuit attitude, if we can just get somebody from the Bruce Arians tree who we think is really just going to be wide open throwing that ball, I think that's what we need.
It seems like an odd fit to me. I will say this. I've gotten so many odd looks from my wife and other people when I say no risk it, no biscuit. I use that all the time.
You do? Okay.
Yeah, heck yeah, that's a great phrase.
It's a great line. I
really
love Bruce Arians.
Bruce.
I loved him. Yeah, he was great that way.
Well, there's another bit of news that came out, and this is the last thing we'll probably have time to chat about as we wrap up here. Grant Udinsky, who is 28 years old and has been the assistant OC and the assistant quarterbacks coach for the Minnesota Vikings, has been confirmed by Mike Garofalo as moving to the second round of interviews. He'll be in person interviews this week. And I'll just tell you, Sean McVay was only a tight ends coach in Washington before he became an OC at the age of 28. Do you think that there's any, what would you need to hear or know to feel good about hiring a 28-year-old as your OC?
Well, the News Tribune made a big mistake hiring a 28-year-old Mike Sando years ago.
Oh man,
to replace John Clayton.
Some of these, that's right. I should replace John Clayton. I think John Clayton was eternally choice by that choice. Who? I think I would be intrigued by it. You better be right. I think that's I think it would be reflective of sort of this enterprising spirit that we've seen with John Schneider and maybe to some extent it'll be Mike McDonald too, of, you know what, we're going to get the youngest we're going to get the youngest coach in the league. It's almost a pivot away from, it's like a little bit more of a taking a risk. Doesn't it feel like they're much more away from the tried and true, which was Pete, and kind of maybe invigorated by some of the discovery. I think they were disappointed in how it turned out with Grubb, but they were real excited about it going in, and even excited about the season. So I guess I would say, hey, more power to you, but you better have you better know what you're looking at and know what you're getting.
Dave, any thoughts?
The thing with McVay, football was a cradle language for him. So at 28, he'd been drawing up plays since he was in third grade, and I think that's some of the way the prodigies are. There's a language you have to know, and it has to be second nature, and it has to be in your DNA and your bloodstream to know, okay. And defenses now are so complex. The combination defenses that coordinators have to not only understand, but understand how to force them into situations in which you have the edge and you have the leverage. It's like having a computer mind that I think you need to really be good at this. Maybe the young guys are really sharp at that because they understand that. And the reason I like somebody who's been in college or in the pros, they get what they have to do. They can't say, okay, we've had this passing attack, this air raid or whatever. It's still in the learning process and shaping process. The NFL defensive coordinators may figure that out in half a season.
So this is interesting to me. So there's not even a Wikipedia page on Udinsky, right? So I mean, we're real early on here. If you don't, if you're a coach without that, but there is a story in the Star Tribune, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, from November. Meet Grant Udinsky, the most interesting man on the Vikings coaching staff.
I'm talking to the author.
Yeah, great. Ben. Officially, the 28-year-old is assistant offensive coordinator, assistant quarterbacks coach. Unofficially, he's mentor to J.J. McCarthy, protege of O'Connell, and the most likely to go off the grid in the mountains somewhere. So, this could be a good sign that, the Seahawks are attuned to the up and comers. Doesn't mean he's going to be a great coach or that he's qualified to be the offensive coordinator right now, but it's interesting to me.
It is fascinating. And in fact, Ben Gosling, the author of that story, you could not have segued better. He is the master. He's been doing this for years, Mike Sando. I'm going to be talking to Ben Gosling here in 2 minutes.
That's great. Say hi to him for me. We used to work together.
I will say hi to him for both of you, and I'm sure he will reciprocate that back. Guys, this has been so much fun, as always. These conversations are fantastic. Only thing missing is beer. We need that at some point, maybe some nachos. But
I've got codeine going.
Yeah. And Dave, please feel better. But guys, have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Great. Thank you.
Great.
All right,
Thanks
everybody. If you haven't already, give the show a like, click subscribe, and we are heading over to a different stream. So if you're in this stream and you're like, God dang it, why don't you just keep it in this stream? Well, because not everyone will be watching this show live, and some people will just want to see the Ben Gosling stuff, and some people will want to see the Dave Boling stuff. So 2 separate streams. It's on the YouTube channel. You can check it out now. I'm heading over there now. I'm about to start up, and we'll see you over there. Until then, take care. This has been episode 299 of Hawk Blogger Mornings. Take care.